In 1760, colonists in North America had the highest standard of living in the Western world. Land was cheap, food was abundant, and most property-owning families paid roughly 1% in taxes. And above all else, they were fiercely loyal to King George III. But that shared British loyalty was practically the only thing they had in common. The 13 colonies operated like entirely different worlds. New England was dominated by tight-knit Puritan communities building ships. The middle colonies were tolerant, chaotic hubs of merchants and global trade. And the South was an aristocracy of wealthy planters running massive tobacco and rice plantations, built on the labor of enslaved Africans. They actually preferred it this way. When the French military threatened the Ohio Valley in 1754, British officials urged the colonies to form a single colonial government for shared defense. Every single colonial assembly rejected it. They decided they would rather face an invading army alone than share power with the colony next door. This chart compares the financial burden of the empire after that conflict. Britain ultimately won the 9-year French and Indian War, effectively securing the American borders, but victory came at a massive cost. The British national debt shot up to £122 million, while the protected colonists were sitting on immense wealth and paying almost nothing to the crown. To Parliament back in London, the solution was obvious. They decided to shift a fraction of that financial burden over to the colonists. The logic was simply to have the Americans help pay for the exact troops that were defending their own frontiers. Which leaves us with a bizarre historical paradox. You have 13 separate, deeply divided populations living in extreme prosperity, enjoying global military protection. So, how did a modest request to chip in for their own defense push these proud British subjects to commit high treason? The backlash to Parliament's plan was immediate. The colonists saw direct taxes on paper and tea as tyranny, strictly because they had no elected representatives in London. Mobs hanged tax collectors in effigy. Merchants organized massive boycotts. British soldiers fired into an angry crowd in the Boston snow. And eventually, hundreds of chests of tea were dumped into Boston Harbor. Britain retaliated by trying to make an example out of Massachusetts. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbor, suspended local self-government, and flooded the towns with troops. The goal was to isolate the radicals in New England and force them into submission, assuming the rest of the colonies would just look the other way. That calculation failed. Instead of abandoning Massachusetts, delegates from 12 separate colonies traveled south to Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from these incredibly divided regions sat in the exact same room to coordinate a unified resistance. When British troops marched on Concord to seize hidden weapons, the fighting broke out. But the thousands of men who surrounded Boston in the aftermath were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers holding hunting muskets. They had almost no ammunition and zero training. It was a regional riot, not a military force. To keep this fragile coalition from falling apart, John Adams recognized they needed a commander who wasn't from New England. He nominated George Washington, a wealthy planter from Virginia. If a Virginian was leading Massachusetts men, it forced the largest, richest colony in the South to put real skin in the game. Putting Washington in charge was a calculated political maneuver. It tied the distinct economies and cultures of all 13 colonies to a single cause, expanding a local dispute into a continental war. In July 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve this document. By signing the Declaration of Independence, they abandoned any hope of negotiation. They were claiming independence in writing, which meant if they lost the war, they would hang as traitors. Almost immediately, the reality of that decision set in. When the British Army arrived in New York with 32,000 professional troops, they slaughtered Washington's inexperienced forces. Washington barely escaped under the cover of night, realizing very quickly that his men could not survive an open-field battle against the Empire. So he adopted a strategy of endurance. He didn't actually need to win decisive battles, he just needed to keep his army alive. The goal was to stay in the field, drag the conflict out for years, and make the war so expensive and exhausting that the British public would eventually demand an end to it. But by winter, the constant retreats were causing the army to dissolve. Enlistments were days away from expiring. To prevent the entire rebellion from quietly collapsing, Washington launched a completely unpredictable attack. On Christmas night, he ordered his freezing men to cross the icy Delaware River in a severe storm. surprising Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was a minor skirmish, but it proved to the men that they could still fight. They carried that survival instinct into Valley Forge a year later. While thousands died of disease and exposure in the snow, the survivors were trained by a Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben. He took state militias that marched and loaded their weapons differently and drilled them mercilessly until they moved as one standardized, disciplined unit. That discipline held all the way to 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia. Washington marched this newly hardened Continental force south, and with heavy support from the French Navy, they cornered the British Army, laid siege to their positions, and forced an 8,000-man surrender. The colonists didn't overpower the world's strongest military. They survived just long enough for years of shared misery and constant drilling to hammer a disjointed mob into a functional military tool. When the Treaty of Paris finally made American independence official, George Washington did something virtually no victorious general in history had ever done. He stood before Congress, resigned his commission, and relinquished his authority. He voluntarily walked away from absolute power. But the moment the British strike disappeared, the unity of the colonies evaporated. The 13 states instantly reverted to acting like rival nations. They began printing their own currencies, taxing each other's goods, and completely ignoring their signed treaties. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation, a framework that intentionally gave the National Congress almost zero authority. The central government couldn't regulate trade, couldn't collect taxes to pay off massive war debts, and couldn't even raise an army. Without a functioning system, society began to fray. In Massachusetts, farmers who were drowning in debt and furious over local taxes started violently shutting down courts. The national government was totally paralyzed, entirely unable to step in and restore order. Knowing the experiment was failing, delegates returned to Philadelphia in 1787. They realized they had to scrap the Articles entirely. Instead, they drafted the U.S. Constitution, a completely new system built on shared federal power, legally tying the individual states together under the opening lines of a unified document. Winning the war didn't actually create the United States. The shared trauma of the Revolution only proved that these 13 distinct regions were incapable of surviving on their own. To keep from destroying each other, they had to finally bind themselves into a single nation.